it's time for Campfire's stories of Bristoe Station battlefield. There it is, there's the bonfire.
Our History by Campfire stories of Bristoe Station, and tonight we'll be commemorating not just the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Bristoe Station, which took place on the very ground that you sit on 157 years ago this coming Wednesday, but we'll be experiencing and going through the experiences of Bristoe Station from 1861 to 1865 this evening. Our story this evening is going to begin just before the first shots of Civil War were fired in April of 1861. And our first character is the former sheriff of Prince William County, who owned much of the land that the battlefield park is on today. He was a Unionist living here in Confederate-occupied Prince William County. After the war, Thomas Davis filed for damages that were done to his property to try and get money back from the United States government. And as a part of that, he had to give depositions about his experience during the war. And this is what he remembered about his very early war experience. Davis wrote, "I talked against secession and used my influence for the Union. I was sheriff of Prince William County, elected in 1856 and again in 1858. In 1860, things were getting very hot, and I declined to be a candidate. When the day approached for the vote on the ordinance of secession, the rebel army had already begun to collect in this section, and the Union men talked the thing over and concluded that the best thing they could do was to stay away from the polls, feeling satisfied that if we voted against secession, we would be mobbed. So on election day, I did not go to Brentsville, my voting precinct, but I went to Haymarket on business. And there I got into trouble with the secessionists. They knew I had a great deal of influence and wanted me to come out on their side. I did not own any slaves and was opposed to slavery and had so expressed myself. And yet despite that, Davis would suffer tremendously during the war. And by the end of the Civil War in 1865, there was basically nothing left standing of his farm or his property. The fence lines torn down, his house literally gone, and his barn and corn crib consumed by the fires of Civil War. In just 4 short years, Davis's farm became unrecognizable.
Camp Jones. The first major combat of the Civil War was fought on the plains of Manassas, along the banks of Bull Run, on July 21st, 1861. This battle amassed nearly 5,000 casualties, soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The armies disengaged after the conflict, but that did not end the death witnessed by both armies and the civilians of Bristoe Station. William McClellan, his comrades in the 9th Alabama Infantry, and other Alabama regiments moved their camp to Bristoe Station in August of 1861 and named it Camp Jones. Disease ravaged the Southerners here, far away from the battlefield. McClellan described the camp in a letter to his brother, written August 24th, 1861. Dear Bob, we are encamped at the same place we moved to 3 weeks ago. The health of our regiment is better than it has been, but I can hear every day the solemn salute fired over the tombless grave of a poor soldier. The 11th Alabama Regiment is just by us. Also the 4th, 10th, 12th, and 17th Alabama Regiments. I was standing guard yesterday upon an eminence which overlooks the valley of Manassas. As far as the eye can reach, you can see nothing but tents and men. Wherever there is a spring, you will find as many men as it will afford water enough for. The army seems to be in perfect lull at this time, but nobody knows how soon it may be changed to the impetuosity of storm. Jackson's raid on Bristoe Station. Battles raged throughout the spring and summer of 1862. On the night of August 26, 1862, Confederate troops under the command of Stonewall Jackson attacked the railroad at Bristoe Station to sever its important supply line for the Federal Army. In the process, Jackson's men wrecked 2 locomotives and 24 train cars on the tracks. Confederate Staff Officer W.W. Blackford vividly described the final crash of 2 trains at dusk. The locomotive plowed under the first 3 boxcars, setting them crossway on its back and on the back of the tender. The impetus having been communicated to the cars, they telescoped each other or got each other crossways on the track. Many cars were forced out upon the pile over the locomotive, and the general effect was very destructive.
August 27th, 1862, about 300 yards that way. The next day, Union General John Pope sent approximately 7,000 Union soldiers to Bristoe Station to open the Army supply line. These Federals encountered the rear guard of Jackson's command under Richard Ewell at Bristoe Station, and a fight raged for several hours that became known as the Battle of Kettle Run. Louisianan George Ring described the opening of the battle. Taking position in front of a fence line with an open field of about 300 yards before us, we calmly awaited the approach of the enemy. General Hooker's division, or part of it, emerged from the woods and with a yell attempted to charge upon our line. But before they passed halfway across the field, were met by a murderous fire from our ranks that caused them to halt, and after a few volleys to fall back in utter confusion. Zolman Ness and his New York comrades were on the receiving end of that Louisiana fire. Their artillery and musketry fire made sad havoc on our ranks. Officers commissioned and non-commissioned, with privates falling thick and fast in every side of us. Our regiment, occupying the most exposed position of any in the line, suffered the worst of any. They had a crossfire on us, and with their artillery and infantry, and in less than 10 minutes, we lost between 60 and 70 men, among whom were 17 commissioned and non-commissioned officers. Approximately 600 men at both sides fell killed, wounded, and missing or captured in the Battle of Kettle Run. Though both armies soon moved on after the guns fell silent, the scars of August 27, 1862 remained with the battle's veterans for decades more. Lieutenant Joseph Egoff of the 2nd New York Infantry received a neck wound at Kettle Run and lived until 1893. His obituary read, "Colonel Egoff died yesterday afternoon at Troy, New York. He was commander of the post-Willard Grand Army of the Republic and organized the famous Tibbetts Veterans Corps at Troy, New York. He was at one time a police commissioner of that city. Colonel Egoff died from the results of a wound in the neck received at the Battle of Kettle Run, the bullet being in such a place that it could not be extracted."
Alright, so between the Battle of Kettle Run, which is what Brian just shared with you, and the Battle of Bristoe Station, which is the anniversary event you all are here for, Bristoe Station remained within earshot of war but few guns were fired in anger around the desolate community. Union soldiers continued to guard the railroad as trainloads of supplies moved up and down the tracks to sustain the federal war effort. And again, that is to the south of us. One Vermont soldier wrote about the state of Bristoe Station in June 1863. In this precarious state of affairs, all business seems to be neglected but that of war. Through these extensive fields, no furrows are being plowed, and upon the luxuriant grass, no flocks or herds are seen grazing. Houses are left without tenants, and many standing chimneys and moldering wrecks mark the spot where recently stood the family mansion, and peace and plenty reigned. But all has been scattered now by the fearful changes and destructive ravages of war. The South, in the hour of its madness, invoked the storm that now darkens their sky and falls with such pitiless peltings upon their war-scourged dominions.
So in October 1863, October 9th to be specific, the campaign that we call the Bristoe Station Campaign starts around Culpeper, Virginia. Keep in mind, a lot of you all know of Gettysburg, which is a well-known Civil War battle, fought in July of 1863. Several months later, the armies will find themselves again in battle here in Prince William County at Bristoe Station. Think about the people that lived around here. You've already heard about one battle, encampments. These people are surviving a war of thousands of people marching and living on their land. And here on October 14th, right where you're sitting, the Battle of Bristoe Station takes place. This would be the largest battle fought on this property. And where you're sitting is where the unit, the 27th North Carolina, would be advancing from my right in this direction toward the railroad line. What's really great about Civil War battlefields with railroads, the railroads are still there where they were 150 some years ago. So for us as historians, we can easily pinpoint where these stories take place because most of these soldiers write about that railroad, that if you live near here, you still hear that railroad, or if you're like me, get stuck on the road because that train stops right there to change engineers all the time. So anyways, I'm going to read a letter from a man named John Sloan, the 27th North Carolina, talking about the ground you're sitting on right now. We were now suffering from the terrific fire of the enemy's artillery posted in the thickets on the elevation beyond the railroad, and from the murderous fire of their infantry in safe position behind the railroad embankment. Colonel Whitfield gave the order to advance. In a moment, we were all double-quicking down the hill, and that hill is this hill right here to my left. Our men falling at every step. When we came to within a few yards of the railroad, the enemy rose up behind the embankment and poured a volley into our ranks, which almost swept the remnant of us out of existence. In our perilous condition, but two courses were open, either to surrender or take our chance and retreat back up that murderous hill, the descent of which had been so disastrous. During our advance, our colors were cut down 3 times, colors being the flags that they would carry. The 27th North Carolina entered this battle with 430 men. In about 30 minutes of fighting up on this hill and down the hill to my left, they lost 291 soldiers. A casualty rate of 68%. Pretty amazing. From behind that railroad embankment is the United States Army 2nd Corps under a man named General Gouverneur K. Warren. These men had been marching all morning on the 14th from around 5 a.m. from a place called Auburn, not too far from Warrenton, Virginia today. They show up here, they've been marching on the double quick, which I can tell you if you're carrying 50 pounds on your back, running basically, they're going to be pretty tired getting here. And when they get here, they see this railroad embankment. They see the Confederates up on this hill. And just like you and I would do today, you would get behind that railroad embankment. That's exactly what they're going to do. Here is a letter from a New York soldier that writes about the experience from his point of view. When within about a mile of Bristoe Station, heavy firing commenced directly in our front. Well, we hurried on, and just as we came opposite the railroad station, a few rods south of it, the rebels opened up on our column from the woods across the track. Soon came the order, by the right flank, double quick march. And away we went for the railroad, which was directly towards the enemy. And of all the showers of bullets I've ever witnessed, this was the worst. Gettysburg was not a circumstance for bullets like this. The distance from where, smoke there, distance from where we started for the track was about 30 rods, across a plain with no shelter. Here we suffered severely, but we reached the track and leaped into the cut before the rebels could form and charge us from the woods. As soon as we reached the track, the rebels advanced from the woods on a long line extending about a half a mile. And he's explaining those Confederates up here on this ridge going down the hill. Now we opened up with musketry and cannon. On came the rebels in the beautiful line which they always keep, until within about 10 rods of us when they reached a small house which was on the left of their line. About this time, a well-directed shot swept away a large number of them, about the length of a regiment from their left, which so broke their line and confused them that those on the extreme left broke for the house, huddled up, and around it like so many sheep.
Despite the strength of the Federal position, Confederate troops briefly broke the line near Broad Run and where Bristoe Road crosses the railroad tracks today, basically through those on the other side of those houses you see there down the hill. Federal troops surged to seal the breakthroughs, including the 82nd New York Infantry. 82nd New York had been raised in and around New York City, had fought in all the major battles, beginning with the first battle of Bull Run back in 1861. The flag bearer, one of the flag bearers of the 82nd New York, was an Irish immigrant by the name of Michael Urell, and he later received the Medal of Honor for gallantry at Bristoe Station, though he barely survived the fight. The 82nd New York was the very first, or the front of the 2nd Corps, so they were actually at the far end of the 2nd Corps line on the other side of Brentsville Road, over on the far side of those trees, not far from on the other side of that hill. One news reporter reported on Urell. The boy, a color bearer, was left for lifeless on the battlefield, surrounded by a ring of bodies. His bayonet was bloodied and his musket stock was shattered from hard work. Happily, someone noted in time that he was still alive. Following their repulse of the Confederate attack, Federal infantry crossed over the railroad and approached the hillside where we're sitting tonight to capture a handful of guns Confederates had left behind with a panicked withdrawal. Those were 7 guns that belonged to McIntosh's battery along this ridge right here where we're sitting tonight. Members of the 19th Massachusetts Infantry, including Sergeant Daniel Corrigan, participated in the capture. The rebels had exposed one battery of 5 pieces in front of the wood, and upon this the 2nd Division concentrated its fire. After the capture of the prisoners, the Major sent our companies K and E as skirmishers, and Lieutenant John B. Thompson allowed Sergeants Corrigan and Maloney and Private Johnson, all of Company E, to advance to the pieces. So they basically advanced up the hill from the railroad embankment toward us. They destroyed 1 gun and brought in 2 in a limber and 4 horses. Sergeant Corrigan limbered up one of those taken by the 19th, mounted the saddle leader, and drove it into triumph down the field and over the railroad tracks with a bump into the lines amid a shower of balls from the enemy and a storm of cheers from his comrades. Besides the loss of the 5 cannon, overall Confederate losses in the Battle of Bristoe Station totaled nearly 1,400, and Union losses were somewhat smaller, fewer, less than 500 casualties. For Michael Urell, he survived his injuries was awarded the Medal of Honor in the years after the Civil War. Went on to become an officer in the District of Columbia National Guard, and in 1898 he deployed with his unit to Cuba during the Spanish-American War to guard Spanish prisoners. He actually retired from the District of Columbia National Guard as a brigadier general. So he went from private in the Union Army to brigadier general in the District of Columbia National Guard before he retired. He died while visiting Ireland, his ancestral home, and his final instructions were to bring his body back to the United States and be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where he rests today. And there are other, of these casualties, 1,400 on the Confederate side and 500 on the Union side. There are still many of them resting today in this battlefield in unknown graves.
You know, the work's not going to get done until we step away from the fire. Anyone that can be helped is with the surgeons. All that's left is the bodies. If it's the smell that bothers you, find a pipe, stand near somebody that's got one that's smoking it. Some of them are going to be easy. If you've seen the lines of the 15th, it's like a bunch of men laying there like they've been cut down by the side. If you see any identification on them, a piece of paper or a tag, write it down, put it on a board, leave the paper with them. If family comes looking for them, you want them to be able to identify it. This isn't the first time. Look around us. In the woods, the gullies, up here on the hill. There's bodies all over. Some of them have headboards, some of them don't. There's Federals. I've seen some from the 71st New York, 10th Alabama. This whole place is a wreck. Just imagine it before the war. Farms, cattle. And all that it is wrecked trains, burned buildings, bodies. We don't have long. It's getting late, it's getting dark. We'll light the lanterns, we'll find what we can. But I guarantee you in the morning, this army's going one way or the other. Either after Meade to Washington, or back down south. So, if there's a buddy you're looking for, make sure you find him. Because once we leave, we might be back, or we might not. So, let's get to it. Get this over with, and we can go down and get some sleep before we leave in the morning and march for who knows where.
We might be back, or we might not, the soldier said. Many of them never left here. Many of them stayed here and are still here today. One of the men who did make it back was a chaplain with the New York Regiment who fought alongside his comrades at the Battle of Kettle Run in August of 1862. And then shortly following the October 1863 battle, he came back. And here's a part of what he wrote back to his family at home. Monday, our regiment was ordered out to escort a supply train to and from Bristoe Station. I went along. On the way down, I rode aside to visit for the second time since that dreadful day the battlefield of August 27, 1862. I found the graves of my boys that fell there trampled by a drove of grazing horses belonging to a battery in camp nearby. It grieved me to see them so despoiled, yet there was no fault to be ascribed. I straightened up the headboards and wrote the names over again, where they were growing dim. Poor fellows, they lie there humbly enough, but oh, how honorably. It was hard to think that all I was permitted to do in respect to their memory was with my pencil, and to keep their resting place from being nameless a little while longer. I felt while doing it with profound emotion that if one's name is written in heaven, he can afford to have his dust lie lowly and I prayed that I and those I love might possess that better part. The Battle of the 14th between our 2nd Corps and AP Hill's Confederates the week before last took place in part on the same ground. Twice baptized in blood for liberty's sake, it will be a place to which in after times pilgrimages will be made by those who reverence the glorious, though suffering past. Whether you come here to run, walk, bird watch, read our interpretive signs, no matter how young or how old, you do what Reverend Twitchell said many will do in after times. Come here to visit this place. And no matter what your purpose of being here, you are walking on ground where the bones of those men who fought over this very ground that you sit still rest. Whether in marked graves, like what we have in the 10th Alabama Cemetery here in the park, or unmarked graves, which still lie scattered throughout the park today. Walking here, running here, reading our signs is a way to preserve the memory of the soldiers who wrote these words and who did experience the changes that came to Bristoe Station in 4 years, where people who came back here after the war couldn't even recognize this. Fences torn down, replaced by cemeteries. The names of soldiers all the way from Alabama and Mississippi to New York and Maine got this landscape. When you come here, again, no matter what your purpose, hope that now, tonight, you'll have heard some of these words from the soldiers and civilians who were here. And you can pass on their experiences and take some time to remember what happened here. Remember it, go home, and pass it on to somebody else. Because by preserving this ground, by keeping this ground, we are keeping their memories, their stories, and most importantly, their words and their experiences alive. Just by sitting here, you're doing that. So I thank you on behalf of the staff and volunteers at Bristoe Station Battlefield Heritage Park and the Prince William County Historic Preservation for coming out tonight to do that. To remember the people, whether it was the civilians, the men and women who lived here, the enslaved people who fled to freedom along the tracks of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad several hundred yards to my right, or the soldiers who fought here. Because you are keeping their stories alive and you are helping us to do that. Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. Just watch your step as you make your way back towards the pavement. We think we've marked all the holes enough and lit it up enough for you, but just be careful as you make your way back towards the parking lot. And again, thank you to all of you for coming out here and helping us to remember not just the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Bristoe Station this coming Wednesday, but also the experiences of these people who witnessed the war at Bristoe Station from 1861 to 1865. So thank you all very much.